Thank you, Joe, and thank you all for being with us. I promise this will be the last thing we say about chemistry, but the fact of the matter is what Livy encountered as a student at Elmira Female College, the thing that would have distinguished it from anywhere else she might have gone was science courses. Right? That was the thing that Elmira College offered, which was not on offer anywhere else for women, was science. And so what Joe points to, this reckoning of the liberal arts, I think is really important as a way of thinking about who Livy Clemens is and what this place meant to her. It's an interesting way to start. I want to say a personal note as we get started. I owe a lot to Barb Snedecor for bringing me to Elmira College. She was one of the first people I met and interacted with and left a really wonderful impression on me during the first year that we worked together. And so it's a real pleasure to get to have her back here and talk about a book that I know has been a long time in coming and a labor of both love and labor.
True.
And so one of the things I wanted to start is one of the things that became very clear to me that I did not know before I came to Elmira College, before I met Barb, was the extent to which Livy's story was really suppressed in Twain studies for much of the 20th century. There were some very influential biographers and scholars who tended to portray Livy as something of a bourgeois nag, right? As somebody who actually may have been a detriment to Twain's career as a humorist and as a novelist. This argument, I think, has been thoroughly debunked, but it stood for a number of decades. And I think it's really important. The question I want to start with Barb is, what happens to the story of Mark Twain, a story that's familiar to, I imagine, many people in the audience and which has been told over and over again over the last 100 years, when we see it through the eyes of not Sam Clemens, but Livy Clemens?
I think this story is far more humanized, far more tender, maybe to some degree far more honest. Samuel Clemens was a performer, an entertainer, a publicist, so I think he was pretty aware every time he wrote something, be it a letter, be it a lecture, be it a novel, he was aware that he was forging his path as truly one of America's groundbreaking authors. When we look at Olivia, we see the woman who's behind all of this, So often, I think in that century, maybe a wife of a famous person was sort of marginalized. She was back there, but not well known. And as was just said, a lot of what we knew about her was through the eyes of, I guess you could say, almost some prejudicial biographers who kind of wanted to pigeonhole her to the side. And I get that because Samuel Clemens is the star of the show here, even in this book. He's kind of the background star of the show. But Olivia's impact on him, you almost can't emphasize it enough. If Samuel Clemens hadn't met Olivia Langdon and married him, one thing we can say for absolute certainty is the story of American literature would have been different. Obviously, he would have aligned himself with someone else. But because he comes here to Elmira, falls in love with her, and then becomes a part of the Langdon family with its generosity, its open-mindedness, its supportive, it's not support, but it's protest of slavery, its open-mindedness about religion, about education. I mean, it helped to transform him, too. So my humble opinion is you almost can't overemphasize the impact of Olivia on his creative output.
I think that's certainly merely by bringing him here, she changed the course of his career. Right? And so many of the works that have stood the test of time were written here, and it's hard to imagine they would have been written, at least to the same in the same way if they had been written somewhere else. You mentioned the progressive politics that Livy is associated with, and in one of the letters that stood out to me, she refers to herself, I think, somewhat ironically, as women's rights Livy. Right? She pokes fun at Sam, and Sam pokes fun at her for the extent to which their backgrounds were so different. And certainly, in one very tangible way, right? She grew up amidst a very abolitionist, radically abolitionist family and community, and Sam grew up in the context of enslavement. And so I think naturally one of the questions is, how does Livy come to reconcile her upbringing, the sort of first wave feminism, which she does embrace, the women's rights movements, the abolitionist movement, the free education movement, all of these things that are happening here in Elmira, in which she expresses some devotion to, with this, I would say, sometimes hyper-masculine, right? Self-described reconstructed Southerner, at times an apologist for American misogyny. Right? How does she reconcile being the, as you said, the sort of supportive wife to this big personality who has, I agree with you, kind of fills up any room he's in, right? With her devotion to making a better world for her daughters and for women in the United States?
It's a lengthy question, Matt. You covered a lot of topics there. Just thinking a little bit. I think she influences Samuel Clemens, perhaps, to change more than Samuel Clemens influences her to change. I think she brings the progressive intelligence to the marriage. He brings the incredible talent and the brilliance of a writer. But between the two of them, they play out a different sort of life together. He bends a bit. I don't know if she really bends that much to give up her beliefs in women's rights, in abolition. Maybe she bends a little bit in her sense of God and religion. Maybe he nudges her in new directions there. That line that you mentioned is an add-on in a letter that she added it in a letter that he was writing. You know, she kind of notes it above his lines. I am women's rights. And I think there's an exclamation point. So that in and of itself is just this, marvelous declaration in that century, right? That she recognizes herself as a woman that matters. Is that enough of an answer? I mean, like I said, that was a mighty big question.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think that, and it draws me into something that I found incredibly interesting about reading this book, which is the extent to which their relationship seems to be very much at home on the page. Right? That there are these occasions when they actually collaborate in letter writing, many occasions, right? And some of them rather idiosyncratic, right? Sitting across from each other, writing, one writing towards the bottom of the page, the other writing towards the top of the page. That there is this real, a real capacity for expressing their devotion to one another that sometimes actually seems to be more profound when they are apart and when they are discoursing through their letters. And I wondered how you would characterize, having been embedded in Livy's archive for
A number of years.
For a number of years, yeah. How you would describe her interest in literature, right? And the way that her writing style, which is, I think, quite wonderful, develops, and how it balances and interrelates with Sam's.
Yeah. Well, clearly she was a very well-read young woman. She was born into the Langdon family and had wonderful, principled, adoring parents who cared very much about each one of their children having a good education, right? This is for Susan Crane, their adopted older daughter, for Olivia, and for Charles, her younger brother. In the early letters, we see her back and forth with her good friend Alice Hooker Day, after she marries. They're batting back and forth book titles, things they're reading, things they're talking about with their friends. It's a lively conversation for young women. And I think they're both privileged women. They're not struggling with poverty or disease or illness as many people in that century were. So we have to acknowledge that. Olivia came from a privileged background. But clearly her love of language and of reading was something that they saw in each other. It was an early thing that glued them together. Everybody knows, I think, probably in this audience, that the whole courtship period was mostly a letter-writing courtship. They did see one another. He came to Elmira. They were physically together, getting to know one another. But so much of what took place in the courtship period was through letter writing, expressing their feelings back and forth. And anyone who has dabbled into his courtship letters is usually pretty blown away by his language, his unbelievable outpouring of affection and love for this woman, like a worshipful kind of feeling almost, and a willingness to change, to align himself with her and her family too. Now, Olivia's courtship letters are gone. We only have one left from that period. And interestingly, in that one, she is also somewhat worshipful and just grateful that Samuel is in her life. So language and writing, reading, was something that they shared in common, clearly. Is that enough of an answer? You could go on forever with any of these questions.
Do you think Sam viewed her as part of his process?
Yes.
And in what ways did she contribute to his development as a writer?
I mean, there's the writerly part of it, right? So we're only reading letters here, we don't know what their conversation was back and forth, but if their conversation was anything like the letters, I mean, it was a lively, playful dialogue with allusions to literature and to the events of the day, over the course of all the letters, I'm not just talking about the early letters. Though the early letters, we can say, were especially lively and playful. Of course, they were courting and falling in love and, winning one another's affections. What was the second part of that question?
How do you think
I'm the comic relief here.
How do you think she contributed to his process? I think this has often been a question in Twain studies, that she was some sort of sounding board for certain, and he often referred to the impact she had on his work.
Right.
And I was curious, from her perspective, how that impact was achieved or recognized.
I always have to respond to that question by saying I was a little surprised to not see more of her in these letters, sort of doctoring up what he was writing. She does have some marvelous letters when he's on the lecture circuit, right? When he's the comedian traveling the globe or the United States or the region, wherever he might be. She's very concerned to help him structure a fun lecture. Very specifically, she'll list, why don't you use the Blue Jay yarn from this chapter or this piece from A Tramp Abroad, or it's really kind of cool to see how well she knew his writings, that she could just produce this list of recommendations for him to include in his lectures. And then, interestingly, after the bankruptcy happens, right, and they just fall into this terrible abyss of worry and incredible debt, and they embark on the Around the World lecture tour to try and pay down the debt, right? Dollar for dollar, as Olivia insists. You see a wonderful letter there where, again, she's making some suggestions about what should be included and concerned that the audience gets their money's worth, So that's about lectures, right? Not about writing specifically. Though she will mention that he's working on this particular piece and things are going well. There's a nice comment about when he's working on Adventures of Huckleberry Finn right here in Elmira. So there are those comments throughout the letters, but not huge detail. I believe it's the housekeeper, the maid, right? Her reminiscence that is the one that gives us this vision of the stack of manuscript papers piling up beside the bed, and Olivia going through those in the evenings. But that isn't so represented in her letters. And of course, those of us who are familiar with the Quarry Farm scene know that there he would be producing his manuscript pages in the study and then head down at dinner and read his manuscript pages that day produced out loud on the porch. So some of the comments that perhaps Olivia was making to him in nudging him along in ways were probably oral, and they're gone.
One of the things I noticed, and this begins very early on, is she complains, I think it might have been to Alice Hooker Day, she complains that people view him only as a humorist, right? And that this would become something that Sam himself would reckon with, but not necessarily as early as I think Livy does, that she wishes for him a reputation that is beyond just the joke teller, the humorist. And that comes back over and over again, as you mentioned, when she recommends things that she wants him to perform or things that she wants him to submit, she often turns towards the stuff that is more sentimental, right? That is more romantic, that demonstrates his capacity to make people cry as well as make people laugh. And so I was curious if that was something that you saw her responding to, right? A kind of the way his reputation was developing in ways that she didn't think were necessarily representative of who she knew.
Right. And maybe to add to that, who she hoped he could become, right?
Yeah.
This letter that Matt refers to, something along the lines of, people only know you as the wild humorist of the Pacific Slope, kind of a famous line in Twain studies, the wild humorist of the Pacific Slope, meaning out in the West in California, he was known as primarily a humorist in the early part of his development as an author, and she hoped and perceived that there was more to him than that. And there was. I have often thought about the letter that Samuel writes a few days after they've married. So you know the story, I'm sure many of you. They marry here in Elmira, and they transport themselves up to Buffalo. And Samuel thinks he's renting a home, or an apartment perhaps, in Buffalo. And he gets there only to discover that Olivia's father and mother have purchased this gift home for them as a wedding present. A beautiful home on one of the best streets in Buffalo at the time. I mean, just think of that, right? When you want to think about the influence of the Langdon family on his development as a writer. Imagine that. I mean, he grew up in sort of rough and tumble circumstances in Missouri. His family was not wealthy. You know, there was struggle and there was sometimes a lack of love, right? He's pretty clear about the lack of affection in his childhood and his early years. And now he marries into the Langdon family, which I guess is not correct. I mean, technically she's marrying into his family if we want to follow the conventions of that century, right? But this letter that he writes a couple of days after he's married is just this incredible awakening that's going on in him, right? He starts to sort of reminisce in this letter about his boyhood and his years in Missouri, and you can almost hear Tom Sawyer starting to emerge, you know. Huckleberry Finn, he writes the letter to his oldest and dearest boyhood friend, Will Bowen. And interestingly, in this collection of letters, Olivia is also writing a letter a couple of days after she's married to Samuel, you know, to her mother and father back here in Elmira. And she just expresses the joy that Samuel feels to be in this home. You know, he can hardly sleep at night because he's thinking about the beautiful rooms, you know, and it's just, to me, a hugely important a moment for both of them. You know, they're both writing these letters, probably in different rooms, I don't know, you know, but they're both just experiencing this sense of joy, right? A new beginning, seeing life together for the first time. And so, you know, Clemens is suddenly safe and warm and loved, and the wellspring of what will become his literature starts to emerge. So my friends, I just feel like I can't say enough about how important the Langdons are.
I really love that, and I think it rings incredibly true that there is not much effusion, not much joy in Clemens' writings in the 1860s. Right? Though he is making a reputation for himself as a burlesque humorist, as a satirist, as to some extent a kind of radical political thinker in the Bohemian West, right? He doesn't show any of the capacity for writing hymns, as he would sometimes call it, that comes out in the Quarry Farm style, right? That comes out particularly in something like Adventures of Tom Sawyer. And I wonder if in those really rough, lean years that he was on in the West and becoming a writer, whether he had any experience with the kind of pleasure, right? The kind of joy, right? The kind of familial nostalgia that clearly is a big part of his relationship to Livy and the Langdons. And I think that may be one way of thinking about how his literature sort of bursts open in the 1870s, primarily at Quarry Farm, and this is where I'm going to transition into what seems like a very obvious question.
Well, before we go there,
yeah, please.
Forgive me, I just want to slip in something that from this letter that I was talking about, okay? Yeah. So they married on February 2nd, 1870, so this is February 6th, 1870, so 4 days afterward. That she's in this beautiful home on Delaware Avenue in Buffalo. And somewhere in the house, Clemens is writing his letter to his best friend, too. Just a few paragraphs just to give you a taste. Ellen was one of the servants. The house also came with servants and furnishings, my friends. So Ellen, the servant, asked me last night if I was not homesick. I said no, that I was as happy as a queen. It seems almost naughty not to feel homesick after the dear old home. She's writing this to her parents. I guess I should have refreshed that. It almost seems naughty not to feel homesick after the dear old home here in Elmira in Langdon Plaza, right? But that I am not, you are responsible. Perhaps if I had hourly to meet strangers about me, I should have a homesick feeling, longing for my old faces. But with only Mr. Clemens with me, there is no danger of my growing to feel strange. A few paragraphs later, she says, she's talking about the beautiful blue clock that her mother and father has given them, and how much Mr. Clemens loves it. And then she says, Samuel said yesterday that it was well that there was no one with us now, because they might be almost surprised at our constant exclamations of delight. When he looked in at our bedroom the other morning, he said that he fairly started at seeing the beauty of it. The first tarnish that we have got on our new home is 3 spots of ink on our bright scarlet table cover. We did not know which of us did it, but we both mourned that it was done. But I immediately ceased the mournings, saying that the house was to be a home, so those spots were the first evidence that the house was used. So we put our inkstand over them and comforted ourselves. But yesterday, when we went downtown to do 2 or 3 errands, Mr. Clemens bought 2 large sheets of blotting paper to put down on the table under the inkstand, one here and one in his study. She ends this letter in a really beautiful way by saying, the time of not eating and not sleeping has gone by for both of us. We eat and sleep now.
That's lovely, and I think, interestingly, that idea of feeling strange is exactly what I wanted to turn to as well. And I'm going to read first a letter. One of the wonderful things about Barb's book is it allows us to reconstruct their conversations, at least to some degree, in a way that no existing texts really allow for. Right? As wonderful a job as the Mark Twain Project has done out at UC Berkeley in recovering and sharing Twain's enormous archive of correspondence, we have very little access to Livy's side of it. Mm-hmm. Right? And now one of the wonderful things for Twain scholars like myself is the ability to go look, right, and see what it was that that Sam was responding to, sometimes in letters that we know relatively well, including the one I'm about to read. And this was something in the holiday season, something that Livy wrote to Sam just after their engagement. They were engaged around Thanksgiving in 1868, and Twain went back out on the road and continued lecturing. And she wrote to him a letter that he received on Christmas Eve, and he started to reply. This was the letter that he received. Today I've been feeling sad at the thought of ever leaving this home of mine, ever going out from among those who have always made a part of my life. To think of having them grow used to my being absent from them, so that at last they would cease to miss me, made me feel as if I wanted Father to put his arms about me and keep me near him always, always. He said last night that if he could live as long as I did, he would never let any man take me away from him. And he said that when I left home, he was going to sell out. He is good at making threats. A bit of humor from Livy, right? But I wanted to read how Sam responded and give you a sense of the way the discourse between them brings out really fantastic things from both of them. And he says, I just don't wonder that it makes you sad of leaving such a home, Livy, such household gods. For there is no other home in all the world like it, no household god so lovable as yours anywhere. And I shall feel like a heartless highway robber when I take you away from there. But I must do it, Livy, I must. But I shall love you so dearly and try so hard all the days of my life to make you happy, and shall so strive to walk as you do in the light and the love of God, and some of the bitterness of your exile shall be spared you. But oh, they never would cease to miss you, darling. And then he says he reads the passage again, and he reads her letter again. I'll not read that passage again for an hour, for it makes the tears come into my eyes every time in spite of me. You shall visit them, Livy, and so often that they cannot well realize that you are an absent. You shall never know the chill that comes upon me sometimes, when I feel that long absence has made me a stranger in my own home. But then I see them taking delight in things that are new to me, in which I do not comprehend or take an interest in. For the I'm skipping forward a little bit, but he's reflecting now on his own childhood, something that we don't see much from him up to this point. I see them heart and heart with people I do not know who are nothing to me, and so I can only look in upon their world without entering. And I turn me away with a dull, aching consciousness that long exile has lost to me that haven of rest, that pillow of weariness, that refuge from care and trouble and pain, that type and symbol of heaven, home. And then, away down in my heart of hearts, I yearn for the days that are gone and the phantoms of the olden time, for the faces that are vanished, for the forms I loved to see, for the voices that were music to my ear, for the restless feet that have gone out into the darkness to return no more forever. But you shall not know this great blank, this awful vacancy, this something missed, something lost, which is felt but cannot be described, this solemn, mysterious desolation. I, with my experience, should dread to think of your old home growing strange to you. I always have trouble reading that without tearing up. And part of the reason, perhaps, is the whole reason we're here begins with that promise, right? That there is no Center for Mark Twain Studies. There is no Mark Twain study, right, without that promise that he makes that her home will never come strange to her. Right? That marks this annual pilgrimage that they make to Quarry Farm starting in 1870. Right? And clearly this place takes on something for Sam. And I've spent a lot of time discussing that over the years. I'm interested tonight in what it takes on for Livy. What does Elmira mean to her, this place that she cannot bear to imagine being away from terribly long, right? How does she understand this home?
Yeah, just to drop back a little bit, the relationship between Olivia and her father, Jervis, was apparently just really intensely full of love. Her girlhood friend describes the relationship between Olivia and her father as almost like lovers. You know, they just are so tender with each other and love each other so much. So I feel that Olivia was so fortunate and blessed in her childhood, in the family that she was born into. She knew what real parental deep love was. And what we understand of Samuel Clemens, not so much, you know. When he first comes here, he famously says, "This is the pleasantest family I ever knew," which is a beautiful line describing them. So again, just to share you a couple of letter excerpts about her feelings about Elmira and Quarry Farm. This is, 1881, so they married in 70, so they've been married 11 years by now. They have three children. They've had 4, but the first son passed away, so they're a real little family now, you know. And in this letter, she is writing to, a friend, just a friend, not her parents. So she says, "We are now all at my sister's on the hill near Elmira. As I write, baby Jean is sitting beside me playing with a little basket of marbles. Mr. Clemens is lying on the sofa watching her and every little while laughing at her performances. She is a dear, fat, healthy little baby and a great comfort to us all. She looks very much like her father and is very fond of him. She will go to him from anyone. In fact, begins to scold to have him take her as soon as he comes in sight. We had a long and very tiresome trip from the seaside here, but now that we are nicely settled here, we feel so exceedingly satisfied and contented." This is at Quarry Farm. "It gives the children a taste of real country life. It is a most lovely spot. My sister has never stayed here during the winter, but she is going to try next winter and see if they can be comfortable. It is on a high, very bleak spot, and it may be too hard for her husband to go up and down the hill in the winter. Sound familiar? The roads are so very slippery with ice and snow that it is difficult for a horse to go up and down sometimes. And as he is obliged to go down every morning to his business and up every night, they may find that it is not practicable to stay through the winter. They have spent 9 summers here, and we have spent 4 or 5 with them. Little Jean was born here last summer, and Clara was born here 7 years ago, last June. I tried to mark some because I felt it would be fun for you to hear. This is quite if we want to advance far, as she approaches the end of her life, right? This is 1903. She dies in 1904. She comes down with heart failure and has a 22-month-long plunge into death, and it's a long, slow haul. In one of her letters, she says words to the effect, I feel somewhat better today. I don't expect to die as I did yesterday, you know. So I'm in this time period now. I zoomed ahead. But this is about Quarry Farm. Let me make sure I'm in the right place. I'm sorry after that introduction. Oh, boy. You got to fill up the time a little bit, Matt, while I fumble for it.
And I think this is one of the reasons why I wanted to have this conversation, one of the reasons why I wanted to draw attention to Livy's descriptions, is that they reveal something that we don't get from Sam. For Sam, Quarry Farm is a respite. Right? It's a place where he works. It's a place where he becomes a domestic, a father, a husband, finds his domestic bliss. There is, to some extent, he becomes a different person when he's here. Whereas I think for Livy, she kind of becomes herself. And I think the passages bring that out.
So this is, again, sorry that I couldn't get to it right at the right moment, but we're in 1903, September of 1903, so she has less than a year to live at this point, and they've been up at Quarry Farm for several months before they plan to return to Italy, where they hope the weather will be better for her health. And she's writing to a good friend back in Hartford, "My beloved Mrs. Whitmore, for 4 weeks I have been trying to send you a note. Now I intend to do it without trying." Pretty nice humor for a woman who's in really rough shape. "I have had a very pleasant summer here at the farm with my sister, and on these superb autumn days, I greatly dislike the thought of going into the city. How I wish you could have been with us today. My nurse, who has been with me nearly a year now, took me in my wheelchair, with Jean to help, up into the woods which lie quite a distance away from the house. It was most beautiful, and I greatly enjoyed being there. It would have been still more beautiful if you had been there to help me enjoy it." This is sort of a beautiful image to those of us who know Quarry Farm, right? And so many of the associations are with Samuel Clemens, rightfully so, but here's Olivia, you know, nearing the end of her life, getting pushed up the hill in a wheelchair, and still enjoying so much the beauty and peace of that place. So a beautiful letter. And her voice, you know, he read those long passages by Samuel, and, you know, they are pretty flowery, you know. I mean, the level of diction between the two of them is noticeable, I think, when you hear them back and forth. There's just such a genuineness about her voice in her letters, and, you know, you can only presume in their spoken conversation. The book title, Gravity, sort of is an attempt to speak to that. That was a nickname that Samuel used just a few times, probably less than a half a dozen times early in their courtship. He called her Gravity. And I just feel that she was his gravity, and I think you almost can hear it in these letters when you go back and forth.
That was one of the things I wanted to ask you about, was these pet names, right?
Mm-hmm, yeah.
And you capture I think the really powerful metaphor that gravity is to describe her, her force upon him. But she calls him youth.
Yes.
Which is also a kind of really ironic, interesting thing, given she's 10 years younger than
Exactly.
him and far less experienced when they first meet. And I wondered what you thought of that. She does, unlike, as you said, he calls her gravity a handful of times. She calls him youth in every single letter, all the time.
Throughout the entire conversation,
their entire life, their entire correspondence. And so I was wondering what you made of her attributing that to Sam Clemens above all else.
Both nicknames make me smile. It's sort of ironic because in her calling him youth, I just feel like just a tiny whimsical sense of humor in that, He was 10 years older, but she saw the boyishness in him, the playfulness in him, and I think she wanted him to feel young. There's letters where she talks about our Sam. She's writing his mother. Our Sam turned 50 today. He's feeling old, I don't want him to feel old, basically, And so I think that was her attempt. Maybe she was keenly aware that he was 34 and she was 24, and she saw the playfulness in him. And his, of course, he saw that he makes clear that he saw that her sense of humor was less than his, less ready at the hip, right? But there was also just this tremendous attractive force between the two of them, clearly, a force as strong as gravity. I just really love both nicknames. It's pretty sweet.
Yeah, absolutely. We want to make sure that there is opportunity for you to ask questions, and so I'm going to turn it over to the audience.